quick show of hands, and just be honest with yourself. When life gets genuinely hard for you, when the news is bad, when the relationship is fracturing, when your anxiety hits at 2 a.m., what do you actually reach for? Do you reach out for your phone? Do you reach out for food? Do you reach out, and do excessive work? Do you reach out to a distraction? Is it another person? Most of us ultimately at least arrive at God eventually, but it's rarely the first call, even though that most of us arrive at God. But oftentimes you find that God is rarely the first call that we make. And so today, I want to talk about why that might be the case, and more importantly, how it changes. And for most of you that are not familiar with research on attachment, in fact, in the psychology of attachment, there's a concept called proximity seeking. Now, proximity seeking is sort of the drive that pushes a child towards an attachment figure when they feel frightened or are in distress. In other words, you see it in every toddler who, the moment something is going wrong, immediately they scan the room for their parents' face. And that instant in itself doesn't just disappear when we grow up. We still scan even when we grow up. We still reach for our caregivers, our attachment figures. And the question is, what are we ultimately reaching towards? In fact, in chapter 2 of Bonding with God, my book Bonding with God, I describe this very phenomenon as one of the defining features of a living faith, a habit of turning towards God, not just eventually, but instinctively. When something happened, the first autonomous response is to turn to God. You're not turning to God as a last resort, but as a first response. And I think the theological version of this, it's with James in James 4:8. Come near to God and he will come near to you. Now, I think this sounds kind of simple but for most of us, coming near, it's part of that requires the most work. Let me name, 3 things that typically replaces God as our first refuge. The first is distraction, the spirit of distraction. When we don't consciously choose to avoid God, we just feel every imagine. We scroll, we stay busy, we keep moving, and in the absence of silence, we never have the space to turn. The second is fear and guilt. In fact, we believe, usually unconsciously, that we need to arrive at God with our act together, that there's a minimum condition for being heard. And so we cannot spend time trying to fix ourselves before we come to God. But that's like a sick person waiting until they are healthy before they go to the doctor. Now, of course, a sick person have to go to the doctor either way, whether they are sick or healthy. Now, but the third problem or the third thing is disappointment. Now, this one I think is much harder because it's the accumulated weight of prayers that seemed unanswered, of silences that, stretched too long, of times when God turned and felt that nothing was coming out of that. And over time, that weight of disappointment can make us hesitate to reach out to God. No wonder that Paul in Hebrews 12:1 say that we should lay aside every weight that hinders us from looking up to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. But here's what the research in my book actually, and the testimony of hundreds of young people that I interviewed for this book, here's what research shows, and what some of the testimonies that I've learned and heard from this book consistently shows. It shows that closeness with God is not primarily a feeling, but rather it is a practice. It is something that develops through repeated intentional turning, repeated intentional proximity seeking behavior towards God. In fact, one of the young people that I interviewed in my book described feeling closest to God, not in church, but actually in formal prayer. Not in church, not in formal prayer, but actually on long walks in nature. When she's out on the beach, when she's walking her horse, that's where she would simply talk to God out loud about her day. In fact, another person in my book that I interviewed, another of the young person, actually told me that it was actually the early morning silence that she felt before the house woke up. She was a young mother, and so before everyone woke up, she had to stay up, and that was the time that she could speak to God. In fact, for another person, it was the worship music in the church at full volume, in the church, or in his car, he was, as you can guess, he was a Pentecostal, right? Now, the form does matter, but also I think the form also matters less than the habit itself. But the main question is, what opens the door for you to seek proximity to God? Because everyone has some kind of map, what I call in the book closeness map, sort of a set of conditions under which they actually historically felt near to God. And most people have never deliberately identified theirs. For me, one of the things that does that for me also is worship. There are certain tunes and certain worship music that opens up my heart. Now, if you're thinking about how to draw closer to God this week, I would encourage you to pick up my book. But most importantly, I could also give you an exercise that you could do. Now, write down the last 3 times that you genuinely felt close to God. Where were you at this time? What were you doing? What conditions made it possible for you to feel that? Now, that particular list, it's your closeness map. And once you have it, you can intentionally recreate those conditions. You can stop waiting for closeness to happen out of thin air, or wait for God to appear to you in a dream, and start creating the environment where you know that it grows. And then once you do that, then take one thing on that list and protect time for it this week. In fact, put it in your calendar, not as a spiritual obligation, but as a door left deliberately open so you can encounter God, because God is already near. And what are you doing to notice it? I'm hoping that you can start that journey today. Now, if you've not picked up my book, Bonding with God, I would encourage you to do that, because in the book, there's a lot of tons of nuggets and empirically backed insights, empirical insights, and empirical and scientific insights that's enriched with theological insights as well, and wisdom to help you live a flourishing life through your relationship with God. I look forward to seeing you next week. This is Victor Counted. God bless.